Somewhere in a quiet German town, behind a wall that had no business being there, workers broke through the concrete and found a vault. Inside, files, photographs, personnel records, all of it sealed since 1945. Names. Numbers. Crimes that were never prosecuted. And the most disturbing part? The governments who knew it existed, chose to say nothing. By the end of this, you'll know exactly what was inside that vault, who kept it secret, and why the records it contained could have rewritten the verdicts of the Nuremberg trials. This isn't a rumor. This isn't a conspiracy. The documents are real, and they've been sitting in archives that were deliberately kept from public view for decades. May 8, 1945. Germany surrenders. The war in Europe is over. But here is what the history books never quite explain: the moment the guns went silent, a different kind of chaos erupted. Allied forces were racing across a defeated country, and everywhere they went, they were tripping over paper. Millions of documents. Personnel files. Execution orders. Membership rolls. Medical experiment logs. Transportation manifests from the camps. The administrative skeleton of the most meticulously bureaucratic genocide in human history. The Nazis documented everything. That was their fatal flaw, and, as you'll see, sometimes their greatest shield. The Allies knew they needed this material. The Nuremberg trials were already being planned, and prosecutors understood that convictions would require evidence, not just testimony from survivors, but the paper trail that connected specific men to specific crimes. What they found exceeded every expectation. American forces alone captured an estimated 400 tons of Nazi documents in the final weeks of the war. 400 tons. But here is where the story gets complicated. Not all of those documents ended up in a courtroom. Some were seized by intelligence agencies who saw something other than evidence of war crimes. They saw usable intelligence. Names of informants. Lists of assets behind Soviet lines. Scientific research. Encryption systems. And some documents simply disappeared. Not destroyed. Not lost. Disappeared, deliberately, methodically, by people who understood exactly what they were hiding and exactly why it needed to stay hidden. To understand the vault, you first need to understand a place called Bad Arolsen. Bad Arolsen is a small town in central Germany, the kind of place with cobblestone streets and a Baroque palace and absolutely no reason to be famous. Except that after the war, it became the home of the most complete collection of Nazi records on Earth. The International Tracing Service, or ITS, was established there in 1948. Its official purpose was humanitarian, to help Holocaust survivors locate missing relatives, to document the fates of deportees, to create a searchable record of victims. And it did that work. Over decades, it handled millions of inquiries from survivors and their families. But the ITS also sat on something else. Something vast. Over 60 years of collection, the archive grew to over 30 million documents, stored in 26,000 binders, spanning 16 linear miles of shelving. 16 miles. And for most of its existence, this archive was effectively sealed from the outside world. Historians were denied access. Journalists were turned away. Even Holocaust survivors and their families were restricted in what they could see. The ITS operated under an international commission of 11 countries, and those countries, through bureaucratic inertia or something more deliberate, kept the collection locked away. For decades, researchers working on Nazi war crimes prosecutions, people trying to bring perpetrators to justice while those perpetrators were still alive, were told they could not access the files. Think about what that means. The largest single repository of Nazi records in existence, closed to the people who needed it most, for 60 years. It wasn't until 2007 that the archive was finally open to researchers. 2007, by then, most of the perpetrators whose names filled those files had already died of old age. But even that opening wasn't the whole story. When researchers finally got inside, what they found was staggering. Concentration camp prisoner registration books. Transport lists showing exactly which trains carried which prisoners to which camps on which dates. Individual inmate files, some containing photographs. Death books recording cause of death, often recorded with chilling bureaucratic euphemism. Medical records from experiments conducted without consent. SS personnel files listing ranks, postings, and assignments. And here is the part that stopped prosecutors cold. Many of those SS personnel files listed men who, after the war, had gone on to live completely normal lives. In Germany. In Austria. In South America. In the United States. Some of them had been quietly absorbed into post-war intelligence networks, a process historians now call Operation Paperclip and its lesser-known European equivalents. Scientists, engineers, intelligence operatives, men whose files sat in those 26,000 binders, had been given new identities, new histories, new futures. Protected assets. Too valuable to prosecute. The files didn't just document the Holocaust. They documented what came after. The networks of protection. The deliberate erasure of certain names from official records while their physical files remained, sealed, in Bad Arolsen. But here's what they didn't tell you. Bad Arolsen wasn't the only cache. Because while historians were fighting for access to Bad Arolsen, another collection was sitting completely undiscovered. Not restricted. Not classified. Not locked in a government facility under international oversight. Just, walled in. Physically. Behind concrete. In a building that had changed hands multiple times since 1945, whose owners had no idea what was inside the structure they were renovating. And what was found inside that vault would force a direct confrontation with a question that post-war Germany had spent 70 years trying not to answer. But before we get to that, you need to understand something even stranger, because the people whose names appear in those files, some of them were never erased at all. They were in plain sight. Hidden not by false identities, but by the collective decision of an entire society to simply stop looking. In 2007, the same year Bad Arolsen opened its doors, Belgian authorities working in a former Nazi transit facility in the town of Mechelen made a discovery that nobody had anticipated. Mechelen, known in German as Malines, had served as the primary transit camp for the deportation of Belgian Jews during the occupation. Between 1942 and 1944, over 25,000 Jewish men, women, and children passed through its gates, loaded onto transport trains headed east. Fewer than 1,300 survived. After the war, the building became a military barracks. Then a government facility. The history of what had happened there was known, broadly, but the site itself had been largely repurposed and moved on from. During renovation work, construction crews broke through a wall in a sub-basement area, and found a sealed room. Inside that room, filing cabinets. Original, undisturbed, still locked. The keys were gone, but when the cabinets were eventually opened, what was inside was a near-complete administrative record of every deportation convoy that had left Mechelen between 1942 and 1944. Every name. Every convoy number. Every date. This was not just historical documentation. This was a prosecutorial record. These were the files that the SS administrators of the camp had sealed and walled in rather than destroy in the final chaotic days of the occupation, perhaps believing the Reich would survive, perhaps simply unable to complete the destruction in time. The files allowed Belgian historians to reconstruct, for the first time with total documentary precision, exactly who had given which orders for which transports. Named individuals. Dated signatures. A chain of command traced from a sub-basement in Mechelen all the way up through the SS hierarchy. And some of those men had lived out their full post-war lives in Belgium. Died there. Were buried there. Their files had been sealed behind a concrete wall, while they attended church, raised grandchildren, and received government pensions. Here is what the sealed vault ultimately proved, not just in Mechelen, but across every cache of Nazi records that surfaced in the post-war decades. The silence was not accidental. In case after case, investigators found evidence that the existence of specific record caches had been known, sometimes by Allied intelligence officers, sometimes by post-war German officials, sometimes by the international bodies nominally tasked with pursuing war criminals. The Mechelen filing cabinets had been in a building administered by the Belgian state for over 50 years. The Bad Arolsen archive had been under international supervision since 1948. These weren't lost files. They were files that no one with the authority to open them chose to open. The reasons were layered and, in some cases, coldly pragmatic. The early Cold War demanded stable Western European allies, and a full accounting of wartime collaboration would have destabilized governments the United States needed to hold the line against Soviet expansion. West Germany itself could not be rebuilt as a democratic partner while simultaneously being prosecuted for the full scope of its crimes. And the intelligence value of certain Nazi operatives was judged, in classified memos that we now have access to outweigh the moral cost of their protection. The documents that surfaced from sealed vaults didn't just reveal what the Nazis had done. They revealed the architecture of the decision, to let certain perpetrators go free. That is the history that was walled in. Not just behind concrete, but behind policy. Behind strategy. Behind the quiet agreements of men in suits who decided that justice, in this particular case, was a luxury post-war stability could not afford. What do you do with a history that someone tried to bury, but couldn't quite finish burying? The records that have surfaced, from Bad Arolsen, from Mechelen, from dozens of smaller caches discovered in attics, basements, and government storage facilities across Europe, have fundamentally changed what we know about the implementation of the Holocaust. They have given names back to victims who were recorded only as numbers. They have allowed families, sometimes 3 generations removed from the crime, to finally learn the documented fate of a grandparent who simply vanished. But they have also arrived, in many cases, too late for justice in any courtroom sense. The perpetrators named in the Mechelen transport lists died as free men. The SS officers whose personnel files filled the Bad Arolsen binders largely escaped prosecution. The architects of the administrative machinery of genocide lived and died in the post-war world, protected by exactly the cold calculations the classified memos described. What the sealed vaults gave us, was truth without consequence. Documentation without accountability. And the question that hangs over every one of these discoveries, every concrete wall broken through, every rusted filing cabinet forced open, is the same. How many more are there? Because the historical consensus, uncomfortable as it is this: we have probably not found all of them. The vault in Mechelen was sealed for 60 years before anyone broke through. Others may have waited longer. Others may be waiting still. The sealed vault wasn't a metaphor. It was a room. With walls. With filing cabinets. With names inside. And the people those names belonged to, the perpetrators, were not mythological monsters. They were administrators. They signed forms. They went home for dinner. And when the war ended, someone made a decision that those signatures would stay behind a wall. That decision tells you something about power and accountability that no single trial, no single verdict, no single monument can fully reckon with. The paper survived. The men it named, were protected. History doesn't always move toward justice. Sometimes it moves toward convenience. And sometimes the only thing standing between a buried truth and total erasure is a construction crew that hits an unexpected wall. If this broke your brain a little, subscribe. We drop one of these every week. Next time, the classified psychiatric evaluations of the Nuremberg defendants, what the American psychologists found, what they were ordered not to publish, and what one of them smuggled out in his briefcase when the trials were over.